The latest conflicts in the Middle East have featured many familiar faces. Hamas and Hezbollah were household names. We've seen Iranian backed militias in Iraq. And of course, we've seen the Iranians themselves. But one of the surprise groups, I guess we could say, were the Houthis all the way from Yemen, who got involved very early on, and it was sort of a surprise. A lot of people, even in the Middle East, had never even heard of them before and were left wondering, who are these people and what do they want? So in this video, we'll hopefully be providing some context about where the Houthis came from and what they're trying to do. Because as we'll see soon, the Houthis didn't spring up out of nowhere in 2023. They've been around for a while and they have a very storied history. But first, where is Yemen? This is a map of the Middle East with Yemen marked in orange. And before we continue, there are a few things that are important to point out. The first is their neighbor to the north, Saudi Arabia, which is going to prove to be very, very important very soon. Farther north and to the east, we have Iran. And farther north and to the west, we have Israel. Now, directly to the south, we have what's called the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which is very important because anyone coming from the east who then wants to go up the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal has to pass by this very thin waterway that goes right by Yemeni shores. And we'll see very soon how that proves to be important. So that's Yemen. Now, Yemen didn't always look like this. Until 1990, Yemen was actually two separate countries, North Yemen and South Yemen. And we're not going to get into all the particulars about why it was split and why it was unified because they don't touch upon our video. All we need to know is that in 1990, the two halves of Yemen came together to form the one country we know today, which looks like this. And the president of that new country was named President Saleh. So we've gotten an idea of Yemen, we've seen where it is and why it's also strategically located. And we've also seen that beginning in 1990, Yemen became one country, the one we know today, under President Saleh. Now, how did the Houthis get started? So the Houthis are Shiite, but they're not the same strain of Shiite as the Iranians. So the Iranians are what's called 12er Shiites, and the Houthis are what are called Zaidi Shiites. So even though it seems very intuitive to make that connection and say, oh, so of course the Houthis and the Iranians are on the same team, they're both Shiites, it's not that simple because there are very big differences between Zaidi Shiites and 12er Shiites. But in any case, the Houthis are Zaidi Shiites, and they're concentrated historically in the northwest of Yemen. And this community of Zaidi Shiites in northwest Yemen goes way back, and they had a lot of control and a lot of power. And the last Zaidi kingdom actually lasted until 1962. And that capped off 1,000 years, basically, of the Zaidi people ruling that area. After 1962 and as the 20th century moved along, they became more and more marginalized. They lost the political dominance they had had in the past. Of course, they didn't have their own kingdom anymore. And Saudi Arabia, which is Sunni, began having more and more influence because remember, they're in the northwestern corner, so their territory bordered Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia was taking advantage of that. And so in the late 20th century, a movement begins to revive the Zaidi religion and sort of get back some of that political power that they had had in the past. And one of the key people in that movement was named Hussein al-Houthi. He's from the Houthi tribe of the larger Zaidi religious community. He was a religious figure, he was a political figure, and he was one of the main movers of this movement to get the Zaidi people back to at least part of the way to where they had been. So again, religious revival, opposition to President Saleh, who we mentioned, and opposition to the Sunni Saudi influence. Now, the official name of the movement was not the Houthi movement. That's just what it's sort of called because Hussein al-Houthi was the leader. The official name of the movement was Ansar Allah, which means supporters of God. And their slogan is God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory to Islam. Now, this is a really strange slogan If this is a religious political movement trying to get back some power within Yemen, then what's with the talk of America and Israel, and what's with curse the Jews? So we'll get back to that. What's important to sort of frame the narrative here is Yemen has become a country under President Saleh, and this group of Zaidi Shiites in the northwest is becoming more and more marginalized, and they want some of that religious and political power back, and they form this movement. And it's headed by a man from the Houthi tribe, Hussein al-Houthi, and that's why it's commonly known as the Houthi movement. In 2004, conflict began between Saleh's government and the Houthi people. Saleh's government killed Hussein al-Houthi, who was the leader of the Houthis, and there were 6 rounds of fighting between 2004 and 2010. So pretty much nonstop, there was fighting between Saleh and his government forces and the Houthi people. Once Hussein was killed, at the beginning of all this, his younger brother, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, came in and took control of the movement, and he's been leading it to this day. So all that started in 2004, and in 2009, it was really the first time that the armed conflict spilled into Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia got involved militarily. So although the Saudis had a lot to do with it from the get-go because of the influence they were having and the fact that the Houthis were against that influence, it's part of what they were fighting. 2009 really marked the starting point where the armed conflict became something that the Saudis were involved with. So from 2004 until 2010, the government forces are sort of fighting with the Houthi forces, and nothing's really going anywhere. In 2011, there was the Arab Spring all across the Arab world, including in Yemen. And there were massive protests against President Saleh. And the Houthis took part in this. Remember, they've been fighting him for 6 or 7 years. They took part in the protests to oust President Saleh. And it worked. President Saleh stepped down, and in his place, President Hadi, who had been his vice president, took control. And President Hadi was backed by the Gulf countries, so including Saudi Arabia. So, although President Saleh was out of the way, this wasn't really a solution as far as the Houthis were concerned, and President Hadi was just as much their enemy. Now, although the Arab Spring did its work in Yemen and the president was replaced, it didn't really help anything. So things that had to do with quality of life and corruption, none of that was being fixed. On the contrary, Yemen became worse and worse and started falling apart. A weak government, a divided military, Houthi expansion, Saleh loyalists all over the place. So even though he had stepped down, he still had a lot of people who supported him. All these things served to just cause chaos and a very fragmented feeling throughout Yemen. In 2014, so 3 years after Saleh had stepped down, a surprising partnership was formed, where Saleh joined forces with the Houthi movement. Now remember, they had spent years fighting each other, but now they had a shared enemy, which was Hadi and his government. And so the Houthis had an army, essentially, and Saleh had political influence and supporters throughout the country, and together they made a very strong team. And in September 2014, the Houthis took control of Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. And by early 2015, the official Yemeni government had collapsed, and President Hadi, who had replaced Saleh, fled to Saudi Arabia. And so, within right around 20 years, the Houthi movement went from being a marginalized religious group in the northwest, hoping to gain some power back. They went from that to controlling Yemen's capital, and the president had fled. All this happened in 2014, and expectedly, Saudi Arabia began to panic because, as we remember, Saudi Arabia did not get along with the Houthis at all. And they were afraid that the Houthis getting stronger would allow the Iranians to gain more influence in the area. Now, why the Iranians would gain more influence, we'll see in a bit. But the Saudis were not happy at all to have the Houthis be as strong as they were and in as much control as they were. And so in 2015, just a few months after the Houthis took control of the government, essentially, the Saudis formed a coalition of Gulf countries that also included some countries from the West to fight the Houthis. But years of airstrikes and fighting and all sorts of stuff going on didn't really get anywhere, and the Houthis remained in control. And here's a map of the Houthi control. This map is more recent than 2015, so it's from a few years after the Houthis took control, but the territory hasn't changed that much. There's a bunch of different colors here, but we're not going to get into the particulars of the Yemen civil war. What interests us is the dark blue, that big area to the west. That's the area of Houthi control. So we see it borders Saudi Arabia, and it's also pretty big. Now, it's really not most of the country, but it contains the capital, which is pretty much right in the center of their territory. And it also contains around 2/3 of Yemen's population. So it's a nice chunk of the country. It's an even nicer chunk of the population, and it borders Saudi Arabia. And even with a whole coalition of all different countries, Saudi Arabia could not dislodge this force on its border. In 2017, things took another crazy twist. President Saleh, who was the Houthis' enemy, as we remember, who was then bumped out in the Arab Spring and then joined forces with the Houthis to take control, President Saleh now breaks with the Houthis, and he starts considering joining forces with the Saudis to knock out the Houthis. And the Houthis get wind of all this and they kill Saleh. So within a few years, Saleh killed Hussein al-Houthi, who was the leader of the Houthis, fought them for years, joined forces with them to oust the legitimate government, and is then killed by them after he betrays them. So there's all these twists going on, but the Houthis are still firmly in power. Now, as we mentioned, one of the main reasons that the Saudis were so worried about Houthi expansion was that this would be giving a stronghold to Iran right on their border. And we haven't really talked about Iranian involvement here. So, what does Iran have to do with any of this? And the answer is that as these wars were all going on, and as the Houthi forces were fighting the government, and as they were taking over, as all this was happening, Iran was increasingly supplying the Houthis with weapons, with technology, and with know how. And this was all important for the Houthis winning, but also developing all sorts of capabilities that we see to this day. So, all these missiles that the Houthis are firing, some of them are brought from Iran, but some of them are created locally. So, the Iranians were fueling the Houthis essentially from almost the beginning, and that had the Saudis worried. But this relationship is different from Iran's relationship to Hezbollah, let's say. Because with Hezbollah and Iran, it's really a puppet master with a puppet. But here, that's not really the case because the Houthis are also very concerned with taking over Yemen itself, which is sort of an internal thing. And there's also big religious differences. Hezbollah and Iran are both Twelver Shiites. But as we mentioned, the Houthis are Zaydi Shiites, which is very different. And so here it's more of a partnership, where Iran is the more major partner and the Houthis are more minor, but it's more of a partnership than a puppet master with a puppet. But in any case, as time goes on, the Iranians gain more and more influence and they help the Houthis more and more. And this is one of the reasons why the Saudis are more concerned. But it's important, again, to note Iran didn't create the Houthis. Iran merely helped turn the Houthis into the military power that they are today. Now, after all this happens and the Houthis take over and Saleh betrays them and is killed, after all that goes on, things sort of take a step back, and in 2022 they quiet down a bit. And the Houthis are still in control of their area. They still have 2/3 of the population. And most importantly, for what comes next, their area, as we see in the map, borders that very important piece of sea that we talked about. So anyone sailing from the east up the Red Sea to go through the Suez Canal doesn't just have to go by Yemen, they have to go by a Houthi controlled area. And at this point, the Houthis aren't really a group of rebels anymore, sort of running around and fighting guerrilla warfare. The Houthis are really a de facto government running a nice chunk of the country and in control of the capital. And in the rest of Yemen, there's still essentially a legitimate Yemeni government, but we're not going to talk about the internal divisions because we're really concerned with the Houthis specifically. And so they control a nice chunk of the country and a nice chunk of the population and a strategic piece of land right next to shipping lanes. But before we get to 2023, let's take a step back and remember the slogan that we talked about. Right? We mentioned that their slogan is God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, and victory to Islam. Now, God is great and victory to Islam, we would sort of expect. And death to America, I guess it sort of makes sense. Death to Israel, fine. But what's with the curse the Jews as a separate entry? What is this slogan all about? And by unpacking the slogan, we'll hopefully get some nice background about what the Houthis really stand for, which will lead us into current events. So, the first thing to understand here is the historical timing. When the Houthis were really on the rise and this slogan was becoming a slogan, we're talking 2002 to 2003. And at the time, there were important events going on both in Israel and with the United States. In Israel, we had the Second Intifada, which was a big wave of terror and a lot of tension. And with the United States, we had the fighting in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And so, by sticking death to America and death to Israel into their slogan, the Houthis were really fitting their local conflict about control of Yemen into a much broader narrative about the war with Israel, with the United States, with the West, with outside influence, including Saudi influence. And so they were really making this statement that their local conflict was part of something much bigger. And that's always important for a movement that's trying to get off the ground, to sort of make it into something bigger and to rile people up and to get people emotional. And it was very important to the Houthis, and they did a good job of showing how their conflict was part of something bigger than them. In addition, President Saleh, who was still in power at the time in the early 2000s, was cooperating with the United States after 9/11. And the Houthis didn't like that at all. Because now, not only was there Saudi influence in northern Yemen, but the president of Yemen was cooperating with the United States. So this was a disaster for the Houthis. And so the Houthis stuck death to America and death to Israel in there to sort of show where they stood. The other thing that's important to remember regarding this slogan is that revolutionary Iran and Hezbollah were really models of the revolution really working in a way. The Iranian regime had overthrown the Shah's government decades before and was still going strong. They had created and propped up Hezbollah, which was also pretty powerful. And the Houthis took inspiration from this. And so, because Iran and Hezbollah were part of this broader conflict with the United States and Israel, the Houthis sort of got on that train and stuck those things in their slogan as well. So we've seen the historical context mattered, but also who the Houthis' role models, almost in a way, were. But it wasn't all about politics. As with most things in this region, it was about religion as well. And Hussein al-Houthi held that the proper reading of the Quran was not only anti-Israel, but anti-Semitic as well. And that's why we have separate pieces. We have the anti-Israel, death to Israel, and curse the Jews. Because this wasn't just about Western influence and imperialism and opposing the state of Israel and opposing the United States. It was also about being anti-Jewish for religious reasons. And so we have all this coming together, historical factors of what's going on in the Middle East at the time. We have their inspiration being the Iranian Revolution, which worked, and we have religion, which really was part of what created this movement from the get-go, this Zaidi strand of Shiite Muslims, which really created this religious political movement that was both anti-Israel and anti-Jew. Now, for a long time, all this talk about America and Israel and the broader narrative that this little conflict was a part of, all this was just talk. And it was just a way of fitting it into this very big story. But after October 7th, that all changed. And suddenly, the Houthis both had the means and the opportunity to turn those years and years of talk and ideology into actual military action. And so in 2023, shortly after October 7th, the Houthis began launching long-range missiles into Israel. And in November 2023, they started attacking ships in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, that very thin waterway that goes by their turf. They began taking control of it and bombing ships. In response, the United States organized a coalition of countries to protect shipping in that area and strike the Houthis. So the Americans bombed the Houthis, the British bombed the Houthis, of course the Israelis bombed the Houthis, And things would escalate and quiet down and escalate and quiet down, but the Houthis remained with their territory and they remained in power. Today, the Houthis still control Sana'a, the capital, and they still control the very populous northwest. Things have also been heating up lately between the Houthis and the Saudis. The Houthis have been directly attacking Saudi Arabia, including oil infrastructure, and they've also announced a blockade on Saudi shipping, which, as we see with the way the Houthi area borders the sea, that can be very effective. And the Saudis have been bombing the Houthis in response, but as has been the case for the past 20 years, nothing has really been going anywhere yet. And this really goes to show that the Yemen civil war, which started so long ago and saw the Arab Spring and saw multiple changes of president, really hasn't ended. And it's still going on. And this group of Houthis, which have been a major player there for years, have really found their way onto the world stage. And so that's pretty much it. We've seen how the Houthis spent years and years fighting inside Yemen, gaining influence, gaining knowledge, and also gaining weapons. And we've also seen how they came to be under Iranian influence, although they're not as much a puppet to the Iranians as a partner who's influenced by them. And we've also seen how the Houthis didn't just appear out of nowhere on October 7th. They had been around for a while and they had fit their internal struggle into a broader narrative that had to do with Israel and America and the Jews. And that narrative became reality in 2023, when instead of just shouting slogans about it, they actually began shooting missiles at Israel. And although that conflict between the Houthis and Israel and the Houthis and the Americans has calmed down recently, although who knows what's going to happen, the conflict between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia has really kicked up a notch over the past few weeks. They've been bombing each other and disrupting each other's shippings, and who knows where that's going to go. And just as a finishing note, I think this all really highlights that something that's just going on in a localized manner somewhere in the world, right? This war between different groups in Yemen about who's going to have local control, and with minor religious differences or ideological differences, that can very quickly spill over into global issues. And this big war that broke out between Israel and Iranian proxies, all of a sudden, this group seems to pop out of nowhere, and yet they've been around for decades. And I think there's an important lesson there about paying attention and, more importantly, dealing with problems when they're still localized. Because when we just let things become bigger and bigger and stronger, we're playing with fire. Because when things do get crazy, all of a sudden, that can all come back to bite us. So I hope you learned something. I hope this provided some context. If you enjoyed the video, as always, make sure to like and subscribe and send it to someone who might enjoy it as well. Thank you.